The study of ancient societies is a fascinating and never-ending task. New discoveries are constantly reshaping and molding our views of the ancient world. In many respects, those far-off times seem remarkably close to our own. In others, they appear spectacularly different. In this episode, we explore the truth behind some of the sensational aspects of ancient beliefs. We investigate the evidence behind the practice of human sacrifice, including the disturbing evidence of ritual infanticide, the killing of children. We probe the widespread practice of exchanging sex for money in the temples of the gods. The evidence suggests that prostitution is, indeed, the oldest profession. We unearth the evidence of ancient flood myths and look at how attitudes towards early beliefs are changing. For most people today, famine, disease, and warfare are strangers to everyday lives. But this happy state of affairs was certainly not the case in ancient times. The ancient peoples were only too aware of the fragility of life. A deluge or a plague could devastate a civilization. At any time, invaders might descend to massacre a captured city. To prevent these disasters, the ancients knew what they must do. They had to appease the gods.
Throughout time, people have tried to explain the mysteries of the universe and of their own lives. So every culture has its myths and its way of trying to explain how something was created out of nothing, how the first humans arose, the origin of the gods, the origin of the universe.
And an existence of a world of the afterlife which is inhabited by spirits in which you too, when dead, will live. The preparation of tombs, the creation of buildings for the afterlife, the provision of the dead.
And it's not uncommon in human societies to see a great deal of effort invested into something which clearly related to their belief system, loosely to their religion.
These represented society. They were one of the ways in which early humans could imagine something greater than the individual, a kind of grouping, a principle to which they belonged.
When the Christian archaeologists of the 19th century first uncovered evidence of ancient societies, they were horrified. They were shocked by the barbarity they found even in highly civilized classical cultures like Rome and Greece. When they looked back even further to the time of hunter-gatherers, they concluded that these communities must have been even more savage and barbaric.
Early Victorian views imagined that early humans believed that the world around them was full of spirits. Physical objects, plants and rocks had spirits. And so the term that they coined for this sort of belief system was animism.
Animism was the belief that all things in the natural world were alive and possessed by spirits. This applied as much to stones and streams as it did to living plants and animals. Some animist societies believed that each animal possessed a spirit that should be respected. The Celts worshipped pigs and boars. They hunted and ate them as part of a ritual in order to take on their strength.
In fact, to a pre-scientific or a pre-modern age, animism makes perfect sense. It's actually perfectly obvious that human beings are themselves suddenly occupied by demonic spirits that make them run high temperatures and swell up and come out in boils. We call these things bacteria or viruses, but people without microscopes, to call them spirits or demons is entirely appropriate. Likewise, it's obvious that there is a magical animating force which can fry things or light things up. We call it electricity. To people who don't have this sort of terminology, to speak of magical spiritual power, mana, for example, is entirely sensible. And so animism is just a way of talking about the world that makes perfect sense of it, but in different terms from those equipped with a science, which talks in the same sort of way, but using a different terminology.
In the earliest religions, earth spirits were seen to be the creative powers that were responsible for the seasons, for fertility, and for shaping the lives of humans. In their due season, these spirits would nurture crops, cause trees to bear fruit, produce herbs for medicines, and give oracles, shaman, and witch doctors their earthly powers.
Shaman and witch doctors are often seen as being priests, if you like, of some sort of ancient or primitive religion. They're technicians who use a particular sort of technique to bring about trance. They use dancing and chanting and other techniques to enter a different kind of psychological state in which they may have relations with spirits or speak for spirits and so on. So rather than seeing shamans or witch doctors as being, if you like, part of a belief system and depending upon an ancient belief system, I think we can see that they actually can exist and operate within a whole series of different belief systems.
There was one thread common to all cultures. The earth was considered sacred by all ancient human societies. It was considered to be a living creature with an indestructible spirit. It was usually seen as female, made fertile by the power of the male sun. Archaeological evidence gives us some insight into the importance the ancients placed on the female form.
In the quite early Upper Paleolithic period, that's to say the period when humans had first come to Europe, you find little figurines. They're sometimes called Venus figurines. They often do represent the female form. And it's difficult to interpret them entirely, but they clearly relate to some sort of spirituality.
Some of these you can't tell whether it's supposed to be a man or a woman because it's broken or it's just not clear. But the majority of the ones that it's clear what sex they are female. And a lot of these tend to be pregnant females or very voluptuous females, suggesting that they were fertility symbols. Now, a lot of early archaeologists said this was a kind of prehistoric pornography. These were made by men for men.
This created a pattern of cracks. The priestess studied the cracks to find the answer to the question. Archaeologists have found over 100,000 oracle bones And as the Chinese language has changed so little, the questions can still be read. They ask questions such as, if 5 prisoners are sacrificed, will it rain tomorrow? The Shang kings also sacrificed large numbers of people in order to communicate with their ancestors and to try to influence events. Some of the victims were captured in war. Some were slaves. Others were sick or deformed. Sometimes wealthy and powerful people were sacrificed. The choice was the emperor's alone. It appears the gods of the ancient people across the globe demanded human sacrifice. Carvings near the modern city of Veracruz in Mexico show smiling, seated figures. Some are warriors. Others are players of a mysterious ball game. Others still are females. Their smiles, however, are misleading. It is possible that the carvings show sacrificial victims whose natural look of anguish has been masked by a grin brought about by drinking an hallucinogenic potion used by the ancient Mexicans called pulque. In ancient Mexico, human sacrifice was usually linked to war. Captured enemies became the victims. Evidence also points to ritual cannibalism. The cult of the flayed god, Zipe, demanded human sacrifice. In some murals, the most sacred animal, the jaguar, and the most revered bird, the eagle, are shown with heart-shaped objects in their mouths from which something, perhaps blood, is dripping. Other murals show bound captives stretched out in readiness for sacrifice, or at the center of a dance by warriors in elaborate headdresses.
I don't think it's fair to say that the American civilizations were all obsessed with blood. I don't think that's true of the Incas, and it may or not have been true of the Olmecs, but I think it was true of the Aztecs. When you go to the Aztec sites, which of course are all late Aztec sites, the ones that the conquistadores saw, you do see heaps of skulls, or you see skull racks where the skulls are going to be put, and it does seem that they did have a belief that it was necessary to slaughter and sacrifice large numbers of captives in order to shed the blood that would keep the sun turning in the sky. And indeed some of their wars were undertaken in order to obtain captives, which is not a usual purpose for a war, I think, in other lands.
In later Mexican cultures, war was waged largely to capture young aristocratic warriors, the sacrifice of whom would please the gods. These unfortunate young men were feasted and treated to a brief life of luxury, dressed in fine clothes, adorned with the feathers of rare birds, and led to their deaths. The skull racks at Tula show that human sacrifice took place on a large scale.
On the whole, societies which reckon that you need to give human victims to keep the world going are mercifully rare. The Aztecs are a classic example of a society which needs human sacrifice to keep the sun rising and setting, keep the world in place. And that's why you have these enormous racks of skulls of victims, these well-known sculpture and literary sources, which prove beyond any doubt you have this exquisitely cultured upper class, which writes really quite lovely lyrical poetry about flowers, and yet regards it as totally necessary to send thousands and thousands of human victims regularly to the sacrificial block, and to consume their flesh ritually afterwards, in order to keep the world looking nice and normal.
The ancient Mexicans also played a strange and deadly ball game. Enclosed courts with high walls have been found at Chichen Itza and many other sites. Variations of the game were still being played when the Spanish arrived 500 years ago. The ball courts were usually shaped like two T's and were sometimes as much as 60 meters in length. They had richly decorated walls, and in the deep formal courts at major sites, a small stone ring was set high up on one wall. The ball had to pass through the ring to gain points. The game must have been dramatic and athletic. The courts were built in such a way that few people could have watched the game, for this was not a spectator sport. It was more like an elitist rite with ancient roots and religious significance. Players, therefore, wore special costumes to represent the gods. At the end of the game, the captain of the losing team was decapitated. At Chichen Itza, carvings show 7 serpents springing from the neck of a headless ball player. Sadly, no record of the rules of the game survives, probably because the Spaniards destroyed so many of the native Mexican books. The North African civilization of Carthage had an equally bloody legacy. Their spiritual practices outraged other Mediterranean communities of the time. They worshipped a number of Phoenician gods, most notably the husband and wife deities Baal and Tanit. Tanit's symbol can be seen everywhere on the stelae, or tombstones, placed here over 2,000 years ago. This ancient place reveals why the Carthaginians were so despised by their neighbors. Here were placed thousands of small urns, each containing the ashes of sacrifices offered to the gods. Chillingly, the sacrificial victims of the Carthaginians were children.
The Romans accused the early Christians of sacrificing children, and later the Christians accused heretical Christian groups of doing the same, and then the witches were accused of doing the same. So it's the kind of thing that people project. It's a kind of ultimate evil that somebody else always does, and in fact often there are very few people doing it at all.
The practice of child sacrifice remains the most notorious aspect of Carthaginian religious life, but their belief in its beneficial effect was strong. This was proved infamously in 307 BC. In that year, Syracusan troops landed in North Africa with the intention of conquering Carthage itself. Terrified priest leaders of the city prayed for Baal to intercede, and to appease him, no fewer than 500 children were strangled in public. They were then burnt, and their ashes deposited in the Tophet sanctuary.
Now, a lot of early archaeologists said this was a kind of prehistoric pornography. These were made by men for men. This was the best thing they had to Playboy or whatever today. So that was one theory. Now it's sort of gone back the other way, and they say, no, these were made for women by women. And they were to teach younger girls, you know, the mysteries of pregnancy and motherhood. And a lot of rituals seem to be related to pregnancy and these kind of rites. It's quite clear from the studies of anthropologists that men will do all kinds of strange rituals, like let blood come from their penis by cutting it. And this is kind of an imitation of a woman's natural power to menstruate.
In such a world, time was not linear, but cyclical. Ideas of progress and history were meaningless. The passing of the seasons marked a wheel of change that was unbreakable. Birth, life, and death.
The mysteries of pregnancy were very important and probably had a lot to do at the very early stages with how people measured time, because it was important to know how long animals' pregnancies were as well, whether you had domestic animals or whether you were concerned with the movements of wild herds. So this kind of information was important, and at the same time it was mysterious.
The ancient peoples followed the paths of their ancestors to make the most of these seasons. And like every other society throughout history, they wanted to know more about life after death. It was natural that efforts would be made to communicate with the spirits of dead loved ones.
People have always had ideas about life after death. How these arose in the first place, we can only really speculate. Perhaps you could say people have a dream about a dead relative or something, so they think they must be alive. Or you can take the view, as a lot of people still do, that there is actually life after death.
As powerful as any spirit were their ancestors. Their ancestors, though dead, were still there influencing matters. The family on the earth would send off their ancestors to gain favours with the spirits. This became developed out of what we would call the respect for the ancestors, or ancestor worship.
It gives a continuity with the past, and it gives a sense of identity which goes beyond your generation and your children. It goes to your children's children, and it goes back also to your ancestors. So people who have a belief in ancestor worship will see themselves as part of a chain which goes on, which they are just part of.
The promotion of particular ancestors to godlike status is thought to have begun about 5,000 years ago in Egypt, slightly later in Mesopotamia, and about 3,500 years ago in China. As societies became more complex and more organized, rulers reigned over larger populations. It became common for them to be revered as divine after death. Sometimes they were considered divine even during their earthly lifespan.
Most human societies have very well-defined ways of getting rid of the dead, disposing of the dead, which often show beliefs about life and about death.
A very interesting case from Iraq of a Neanderthal man who had been buried, and there was lots of pollen of different plants that was found on top of his body. It's been suggested this might have been a sort of prehistoric equivalent of our funeral wreaths. But it also may have been, in fact, something slightly different. It may have been a kind of medicinal, religious offering, because all these plants, there were 6 different plants, are still used in that region of Iraq where this burial was found today. They're still used in the folk medicine because they all have healing properties.
Most famously, the Egyptian pharaohs took many courtiers and servants with them into the next world, thinking they would need them.
There seems to be this, to modernize, insane idea that when these first great rulers go, they take their social landscape with them. But if you happen to believe so completely in the triumphs of your civilization and of your rulers, and so devotedly, besottedly, completely in your religion, that it's just obvious that when the ruler's going to a great place and you want to get there as fast as possible, the urge just to carry on the party on the other side as fast as you can is irresistible.
One of the most spectacular examples of this practice comes from Sumeria, now part of Iraq. The queen, Puabi, died about 5,000 years ago. Her attendants dressed her in splendid clothes. They covered her cloak with jewelry and tied her wig with a golden band. She was placed in her burial chamber, and 2 female attendants arranged her most treasured possessions around her. One of them crouched at her head and the other by her feet. They were joined by other beautifully dressed and bejeweled female attendants. After them came soldiers, courtiers, officials, servants, and musicians. Down the sloping tunnel to the burial chamber came oxen and donkeys pulling decorated carts. Inside the chamber, each person filled a cup from a large copper pot. They took up their allotted positions and drank. The pot contained a sedative poison. As the musicians played, the entourage lost consciousness. Finally, the royal grave diggers entombed the whole burial party in the earth. Some 15 similar chambers have been found. We may never know why so many important people went willingly to their deaths. No matter how high their status, they were still the servants of a divine ruler. It may have been considered an honor to continue to serve them in the next world.
People can be persuaded to die because they believe that by dying in the right way, whether it's dying in battle or dying for your faith or whatever, is going to make your afterlife state better. And certainly this has been used to make people do things they wouldn't have otherwise have done.
The practice of human sacrifice was not limited to burials. It appears to have been a common element of many ancient rituals.
I don't think human sacrifice was as common as people believe. It's human sacrifice, in other words, sacrificing someone to the gods, is a kind of extension of sacrificing animals, which of course is extremely well developed all over the world for a very long time. So some cultures have gone beyond that and said it will actually sacrifice humans, and often humans have done that willingly.
In ancient China, the practice of human sacrifice was linked with foretelling the future. The Shang kings used oracle bones, sometimes called dragon bones, to discover the future. The emperor asked a question, which a priestess carved onto an animal bone or a turtle shell. Then the priestess heated a bronze pin and pushed it into the bone or shell. This created a pattern of cracks. The priestess studied the cracks to find the answer to the question. They were then burnt and their ashes deposited in the Tophet sanctuary. This horrifying procedure had the desired effect, however. For reasons still unknown, the Syracusan forces withdrew from Africa.
Mostly what we know about child sacrifice is from the remains in the sacrificial precinct, the Tophet as it's called, after a name in the Bible, at Carthage. This was a place where urns containing cremated remains of infants from between neonatal and about 2 or 3 years old. Cremated remains were put in these urns, buried in pits beneath the ground, and little stone monuments, rather like modern gravestones, but these were often inscribed with images of symbols of the deities, or later on with inscriptions recording that a sacrifice had been carried out to the gods.
Children were seen as ideal sacrificial offerings, as birth had only recently separated them from the gods. The innocence of children made them a pure and acceptable sacrifice to the gods, and worthy mediators between men and gods.
To modern people, the most disgusting aspect of human sacrifice in the past has been the killing of children. You find it in Middle America, with certain people like the Olmecs, who, as far as we can tell, did kill off children. The children were dedicated. According to some accounts, if the children cried, if they showed fear, then this helped the rainfall, which is an appalling image. In Crete, in what seems to us in many ways the lovely civilization of the Minoans of Knossos, with those wonderful serpent-bearing goddesses and people jumping over sacred bulls, we find these really rather frightening collections of children's bones at sanctuaries. It could just mean that people's beloved children who died naturally were brought in there to be close to the goddesses and gods, but the way they're carefully stored together can produce some nastier interpretations.
Infanticide, the killing of children, has not only been carried out to propitiate the gods, it was also a method of population control. In times when most people lived in fear of famine, too many young mouths to feed could put families or communities at risk.
Child sacrifice was socially convenient. It was a form of postnatal family planning. Families could reduce their size so that their inheritance and wealth was not split up and reduced too greatly. And at the same time, by carrying out this religious act of devotion, it meant that they were favoured publicly by their gods and were seen to be special within that society.
In some societies, a valueless child would be killed by drowning or abandonment in a remote place. It is easy for us to condemn these practices, but in far-off times they were thought necessary to ensure the survival of families or even whole communities.
One of the great nightmares for the traditional people is famine. And the two ways in which you cope with famine traditionally are to wait for a good epidemic to come on and annihilate, of course, to a fifth of your population, maybe more, or else to limit your population yourself. And to those who don't traditionally see very young children as fully formed human beings, then this is a possible choice. If you see the killing off of children, a society on the margin of famine, as being a way of rescuing the whole society from the horrors of malnutrition and mass death, then it's a brutally effective choice. So, put in this perspective, to dedicate the children you're killing off to goddesses and gods is actually a way of beautifying what you're doing and making it rather less the ugly necessity it is.
Archaeological evidence about ancient practices is hazy. We can only draw tentative conclusions from the infant bones that have been found at sites all over the world. Where most of the infant bones are female, it is tempting to believe that infant girls were the sacrifices demanded by the gods, and there are written sources confirming that in Roman society, girls were killed in infancy far more often than boys. It is unclear whether these were sacrifices or simply killings for economic or cultural reasons. In many societies, even today, boys are more highly valued than girls. Death is not the only matter in which ancient beliefs differed dramatically from our own. It might be argued that the ancients had a more subtle attitude towards the sexual act than we do. For them, there was no simple division between sanctified love and the trade of prostitution. They saw the sex act as sacred. For them, sensual pleasure and spiritual grace were not mutually exclusive. In Mesopotamia, the goddess Ishtar presided over human sexuality in addition to the fertility of animals and the produce of the fields. While she was the goddess of sex and fertility, she was not the patroness of motherhood. Her devotees believed the act of sexual intercourse must in itself benefit the life force in the world. In other words, the more people that had sex in honor of Ishtar, the better their lives would be. Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 5th century BC, recorded a Babylonian custom. Once in her lifetime, every woman of the city had to go to the temple of Aphrodite, the Greek equivalent of Ishtar, and be lain with by a stranger. This was because the task was seen as a sacred commission. Just as today, every religion required funding, and at Ishtar's temple, the funds were provided by the men who came to worship and to have sex with the women. As they approached the waiting women, a coin was thrown, and the woman had to respond, no matter how little its value. The women handed over the money to Ishtar's priests. Sometimes it took years for a woman's duty to Ishtar to be fulfilled, but when the temple finally let her go, she returned to everyday life with no blot on her character. This practice was not unique. Later, sacred prostitution was a feature of Phoenician life. Phoenicia covered a region that is modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Their equivalent of Ishtar was the goddess Astarte. It was said that at Heliopolis, now in Syria, the custom of the country required every maiden to prostitute herself at the temple of Astarte. In Phoenician art, Astarte was often portrayed in heavy makeup and bejeweled. She is usually depicted looking out from a balconied window, an ornately knotted headband of cord around her head. Other representations show her nude in seductive poses.
You're looking at two opposite effects in sacred prostitution, the point of view of the client and the point of view of the woman providing it. If the whole point is that sex should happen in order to honour a goddess who presides over it, then it doesn't matter a whole heap if the person with whom you're having sex is willing. The fact that orgasm takes place, you dedicate it as a magical act, is what's necessary. So when you're looking at the category of sacred prostitute, you're actually looking at an entire range of human experience which spans opposite poles. In some cases it's involuntary, it's literal enslavement. In other cases it's a beastly chore that can actually run on for years till you find a taker. And where you have this slightly dodgy story from Herodotus about women waiting for years if they're not pretty enough in the temple precinct in Babylon, then you could be looking at real human tragedy.
The Phoenicians were famed for their seafaring, establishing colonies across the Mediterranean. Wherever they went, they took sacred prostitution with them. The temples they built had many. Wherever they went, they took sacred prostitution with them. The temples they built had many handmaids of Astarte, and at Kition, on Cyprus, one temple boasted not only handmaids, but also servants of Astarte. These servants were male prostitutes, gathered for the pleasure of homosexual men who might visit the temple. Further proof that sexual pleasure was seen as holy in its own right. The male prostitutes were also known as temple dogs. This was not a derogatory term, but rather it underlined devotion to Astarte. They were supposed to be as loyal to her as a dog to its mistress. By this time, the sacred prostitutes were kept permanently on the payroll of the temple. Prostitution had become a profession, and temple records indicate that it produced large profits. Sometimes the occupation of sacred prostitute ran in the family.
In an area called Lydia, there's an inscription left by a very proud aristocratic lady called Aurelia Amelia, which actually identifies her as having served a god as a sacred harlot, as her female ancestresses have done before her. So clearly there is somebody actually volunteering herself for the job on the spot. And here's a woman who's so gung-ho about it, she actually writes it down for posterity. It's clearly somebody who actually enjoyed her work.
Several ancient civilizations practiced sacred prostitution. It is tempting to judge the custom through the eyes of our own culture and time, but ancient people saw nothing wrong with it. On the contrary, they believed it was a sacred task. The young women who had honored the goddess by becoming her handmaidens were not pilloried and shunned when their work was done, and it is even possible that their social status was higher than those women yet to go to the temple. So far as ancient society was concerned, the women had pleased the goddess, and this, in turn, had increased the likelihood of a good crop yield, healthy animals in the fields, and the well-being of all citizens. In short, it was seen as essential work well done. A temple harlot and the goddess Ishtar play important roles in the earliest known written story. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was carved into clay tablets some 4,000 years ago. The legend is older still, telling as it does the life story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk in Babylonia, who lived around 2700 BC. The Epic of Gilgamesh also relates a story that many historians associate with the early belief systems. This is the story of the Great Flood. The flood mentioned in the story of Gilgamesh is echoed in many other places. The philosopher Plato writes of it in his work Critias. The Nez Perce of the Palouse also recorded a similar story of a great flood, which they survived by climbing the mountain Yamastos. The flood of waters is, of course, in the book of Genesis. Noah, like Upnapishtim, was charged with saving animals and plants from the deluge. It surprised archaeologists digging at Ur and Kish in the deserts of the Middle East to find evidence of severe flooding at both sites dating from the same time. It seems increasingly likely that these stories are related and have a historical truth to tell.
The myth of the flood may actually be the remnants of some kind of real memory of what happened at the end of the ice age, the last ice age, because obviously when the temperature of the planet goes up, some of the ice cap melts, there's more water in the oceans, therefore the sea levels rise, and a lot of coastal areas get flooded. And because that happened basically in so many parts of the world, it's perhaps not too far-fetched to think that these myths that we find, as it were, resurfacing in the ancient world are actually based on earlier myths which have carried on this tradition of when people were actually displaced in large numbers by the flooding of their coastlines.
I'm not a great admirer of the universal significance of great floods. I think the preoccupation with the flood comes very much from the biblical story of Noah's flood, which naturally people in earlier generations believed in very literally, and then archaeologists were hunting around, find a bit of mud that must be a sign of the great flood. And then from time to time you get other people preoccupied with floods. There have been recent work which showed that the Black Sea was at a much lower water level, and then the Mediterranean broke through and caused the level of the Black Sea to rise by a couple of 100 meters in just the course of just a limited number of years. So that would be a great flood, all right. But I don't think it's true that past civilizations have been all that preoccupied by great floods.
We have seen that the most appalling acts have been carried out in furtherance of religious beliefs. Sacrificial murders, infanticide, prostitution, all were carried out openly and with official sanction. The ancient peoples that practiced these rituals were in evolutionary terms no different from us. They had the same physical makeup, and many lived in sophisticated cultures that had complex laws, politics, and religion.
There have been theories that have tried to sketch out a process by which religious beliefs mirror the political formations that we observe in the development of some of these early powerful centralized states, so that as these political units get bigger, these civilizations and empires expand, so the deities, the gods that are worshipped, have a larger and larger remit.
For example, you wouldn't have a king of the gods in a society that didn't have a king. And if you look at the ancient Egyptian gods, you have Thoth, who's the god of medicine and magic, and then you have Anubis, who's the god of the underworld, and also connected with mummification, which was obviously something very important in the ancient Egyptian spiritual beliefs. So these complicated systems of gods and their jobs, if you want, their celestial jobs, tend to mirror the society which worships them.
The religions of the world today may not resort to such gruesome and savage acts as those of our ancestors, but our beliefs still spark brutal and bloody wars all over the world. Murders and assassinations in the name of faith are still widespread. In that respect, perhaps we have more in common with our ancient ancestors than we will ever know.